Get out of here within 24 hours. That's what she said, standing right in the middle of my cabin entrance, like she'd just been elected governor of the state. I hadn't even opened my eyes properly when I saw this stranger holding a colorful printed paper, pointing at my house, talking about community standard violations. This was the land my grandfather left me. I'd been living here for 3 years, never heard of any HOA, and then suddenly someone shows up, demanding to kick me out like I'm some kind of squatter. Who do they think they are? If you've ever been bullied by a self-appointed HOA group, you know this feeling. Comment below where you're watching from. I want to know how many places out there people think they have the right to kick folks off their own land. The morning had started perfectly normal in Ash Hollow. I was sitting on my front porch, sipping my first cup of coffee, watching the mist rise off the small creek that runs behind my property. The cabin my grandfather built sits on about 2 acres of the most peaceful land you could imagine, with tall pines, a natural spring somewhere in the back, and neighbors who mostly keep to themselves. Or at least, that's what I thought until this particular Tuesday morning when my peaceful existence got turned completely upside down. The woman standing at my door had this smile plastered on her face that reminded me of a shark right before it bites. Behind her stood a nervous man clutching a briefcase, shifting uncomfortably and avoiding eye contact like he knew something was wrong with this whole situation. "Good morning, Mr. Carver," she said, and I could hear the fake sweetness dripping from every word. "I'm Tessa Ellison, president of the Ash Hollow Homeowners Association. This is Clinton Ames, our legal advisor." She gestured to the nervous guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "We're here because your property is in violation of several community standards, and we need you to vacate the premises immediately." She handed me what looked like an official document, though something about it felt off. The paper was too bright, the fonts didn't match, and there were spelling errors I could spot even without my reading glasses. I set my coffee cup down slowly, taking my time to look at both of them. The whole situation felt like some kind of elaborate prank, except these people seemed deadly serious about whatever game they were playing. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some kind of mistake. I've been living here for 3 years, and this is the first I'm hearing about any homeowners association." I explained that my grandfather had bought this land and built the cabin, and I'd inherited it when he passed, with no mention of any HOA in the paperwork. Tessa's smile got even wider, which somehow made it more unsettling. She reached into her oversized purse and pulled out what looked like a hand-drawn map. "Well, that's because we recently expanded our jurisdiction to include properties that were previously outside our community boundaries. As you can see here," she pointed to various spots on the map with a manicured finger, "your cabin now falls within our regulated area." The map was clearly amateur work. Someone had taken a standard property survey and drawn new lines with what looked like a red marker, extending the boundaries in a weird, irregular shape that seemed specifically designed to include my property while excluding others. "This doesn't look like any official document I've ever seen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Do you have actual legal paperwork from the county or state that shows this boundary change?" Clinton finally spoke up, his voice cracking. "We have full legal authority under State Homeowners Association statutes, Section 4-12A, which gives us jurisdiction over community safety and property standards. I'd been a lawyer for 8 years before getting into real estate, and I knew enough about HOA law to recognize complete nonsense when I heard it. The section he'd mentioned didn't even exist in state law, and the way he'd paused before saying it told me he was making it up on the spot. These people were either completely incompetent or running some kind of scam, and my money was on the latter. "That's interesting," I said, folding the fake eviction notice in half, "because that section doesn't exist. The real HOA regulations are in Chapter 15, and they specifically state that no homeowners association can claim jurisdiction over properties that weren't included in the original covenant documents." Tessa's smile faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. "Well, regardless of the technical details, the fact remains that your property doesn't meet our community standards. Your cabin brings down property values for everyone else." She gestured broadly at my grandfather's carefully crafted log cabin like it was some kind of eyesore. "We're giving you 24 hours to pack up and leave voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take legal action." The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that I almost had to admire her audacity. Almost. I stood up slowly, walked to the edge of my porch, and looked out over the property that had been in my family for almost 60 years. The cabin was solid and well-maintained, sitting exactly where my grandfather had surveyed it to be well within our property boundaries. "You know what's really interesting about this situation?" I said, turning back to face them. "I used to be a lawyer before I got into real estate development. I know exactly what kind of legal authority you'd need to make the demands you're making, and I know you don't have it." Tessa's face started to show the first signs of real anger. the fake smile finally beginning to crack. That doesn't matter. I'm working for the good of our community. You're just thinking about yourself. Clinton was now sweating visibly, and he kept glancing at Tessa like he was waiting for permission to run away. Look, maybe we should, Clinton started to say, but Tessa cut him off with a sharp look. No, Clinton. We came here to do what's right for our neighbors, and that's exactly what we're going to do. She turned back to me with renewed determination. Mr. Carver, you have until tomorrow morning to remove yourself and your belongings from this property. If you're not gone by then, you'll be hearing from our legal team. She pulled out her phone and started walking toward my driveway, already beginning to film herself. I just want to document that we attempted to resolve this situation peacefully. Unfortunately, we encountered a resident with concerning antisocial behavior who refuses to cooperate with basic community safety measures. I watched them walk back to their beat-up sedan, with Tessa still talking into her phone, probably broadcasting her version of our encounter to whoever would listen. The whole situation would have been almost funny if it wasn't so obviously calculated to intimidate me into giving up my property. The harassment started exactly 12 hours after Tessa's visit. At 6 in the morning, I was woken up by someone pounding on my front door, claiming to be from various county departments, noise complaints, health inspections, environmental hazards. When I asked for identification and the legal authority for these inspections, each one made quick excuses and disappeared when I started asking specific questions about which department they actually worked for. The pattern was obvious. Fake officials showing up with no real authority, hoping to intimidate me into compliance. I called the actual county offices and confirmed that none of these visits were legitimate. But the real escalation came when my power went out around 10:30, even though the utility company had no record of any scheduled maintenance or legitimate service requests in my area. When the real utility technician arrived to investigate, he was genuinely puzzled by what had happened. Someone definitely called this in as a legitimate service request, but they used a fake work order number. We're going to have to file a report about this because impersonating a utility customer is actually a federal offense. Mike, the technician, had been working the area for 15 years and had never seen anything this elaborate. He advised me to document everything and consider installing security cameras because people willing to impersonate government officials usually don't stop there. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up a basic security system and starting a detailed log of every incident, knowing that if this escalated into a legal battle, I'd need solid evidence of their harassment campaign. That evening brought the first glimpse of Tessa's real strategy when my neighbor Lois Whitaker called. Wade, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I heard about some trouble you're having with that new woman, Tessa something. She came by my house yesterday trying to get me to sign some kind of petition about community safety concerns. Lois had lived in Ash Hollow for over 30 years and knew practically everyone in the area. She kept talking about isolated residents who might pose risks to families and asking a lot of questions about you specifically. This confirmed what I'd suspected. Tessa wasn't just targeting me directly. She was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me by spreading fear and suspicion. When I asked what kind of questions, Lois described the typical busybody nonsense about how long I'd lived there, whether I had visitors, and whether she'd ever heard suspicious noises or seen anything concerning. She was really pushing the idea that people who live alone in isolated cabins are somehow dangerous. Complete garbage, if you ask me, Lois said with obvious disgust. I told her you've been nothing but a good neighbor for 3 years, and if she had real concerns, she should talk to you directly instead of gossiping behind your back. But Lois also warned me that Tessa had managed to get several neighbors to sign her petition, including families who didn't really know me but were worried about property values. The community was being divided by fear tactics and misinformation, exactly what someone running a property scam would want to achieve. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just harassment, it was a calculated campaign to isolate me and create justification for whatever Tessa was really planning. The next morning brought a new level of theater when I discovered a small crowd gathered near the end of my driveway. Led by Tessa and Clinton, about 8 people were holding signs that said things like community safety first and protect our families, while Tessa filmed everything for her social media audience. As you can see, we're here peacefully exercising our right to express concerns about community safety, she narrated for her camera. We've tried to resolve this situation through proper channels, but unfortunately some people refuse to cooperate with basic neighborhood standards. The whole scene was clearly staged for content, designed to make me look like some kind of dangerous recluse threatening innocent families. Most of the protesters looked uncomfortable, like they weren't entirely sure why they were there or what they were supposed to be accomplishing. By the end of the week, I'd been visited by fake code enforcement officers, environmental inspectors, and someone claiming to be from the fire department wanting to check my chimney for safety violations. Every single one turned out to be either completely fraudulent or grossly exceeding their actual authority. The pattern was always the same: official-sounding titles, vague legal threats, and immediate retreat when I asked for proper documentation. But the real breakthrough came when Lois called with crucial information she'd gathered from her network of longtime neighbors. "Wade, you need to know what's really going on here. Tessa has been approaching several property owners about selling their land, telling people that the whole area is going to be developed into some kind of luxury resort, and that property values are going to skyrocket if they get in early." This was the missing piece I'd been looking for. The fake HOA, the harassment campaign, the community safety nonsense, it was all a cover for a real estate scheme. "There's more," Lois continued. "Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who owns the big house that Tessa's been renting, told me that Tessa has been pressuring her to sell at a below-market price, claiming there's some kind of urgent development opportunity. And here's the interesting part. Apparently, there's a natural spring somewhere on or near your property that's supposed to be a key feature of this resort development." Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. Tessa wasn't just trying to drive me off my land for kicks. She was trying to acquire properties for a development project, and my cabin was sitting right on top of something valuable. The spring that fed the creek behind my property was probably worth more than I'd ever imagined, and Tessa had figured out a way to try to steal it through intimidation and fake legal pressure. Armed with Lois's information about the natural spring, I decided it was time to do some serious investigating. I started by digging through my grandfather's old property documents, and what I found exceeded my wildest expectations. Not only did my property include full water rights to the spring, but there were also mineral rights that extended well beyond the cabin's footprint. According to the original deed, I owned exclusive access to a natural artesian spring with an estimated flow rate of 500 gallons per minute, more than enough to supply a resort or any commercial development. My grandfather had been thorough when he purchased the land, securing every possible right that came with the property. This explained why Tessa was so desperate to get me off the land. Without access to the spring, her entire development scheme would be worthless. I hired a private investigator to look into Tessa's background, and the results were fascinating. She had a history of exactly this kind of scheme, operating in different counties to avoid detection. In the past 5 years, she'd been involved in at least 3 similar situations, where she'd created fake HOAs to pressure property owners into selling at below-market prices. In 2 cases, she'd successfully acquired the properties and flipped them to developers for substantial profits, while the third had ended with criminal charges when she'd forged county documents. Clinton turned out to be an even bigger fraud. He'd attended law school for 1 semester before dropping out, but had been representing himself as a legal expert for years, providing fake documentation and intimidating property owners with threats he had no authority to make. The most interesting discovery was that Tessa wasn't even a legitimate property owner in Ash Hollow. She was renting from Mrs. Patterson on a month-to-month lease with an option to buy, but she'd never exercised that option because she didn't have the money for a down payment. Her entire scheme depended on acquiring enough surrounding properties to create a valuable development package that she could sell to a real developer. When I contacted Mountain View Resort Development, the company Tessa had apparently been negotiating with, they were extremely interested in discussing a partnership. "We had no idea that the woman we'd been talking to didn't actually own the key properties," the development manager told me. "We'd much rather work directly with the legitimate property owners." Their offer was substantial, not to buy my property, but to lease the water rights for a guaranteed annual payment that would set me up for life. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Patterson called me directly, sounding extremely distressed. "Mr. Carver, I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I'm in a terrible situation. Tessa has been pressuring me to sell my house at a price that's way below market value, claiming that if I don't sell immediately, some kind of community development is going to make my property worthless." Mrs. Patterson was 82 years old and living on a fixed income since her husband's death. She's been telling me that there are going to be legal problems with the neighborhood association, and that I could end up owing thousands of dollars in fines if I don't cooperate. This was clearly elder abuse, and it gave me the perfect opportunity to turn the tables on Tessa completely. I arranged to meet with Mrs. Patterson the next day, bringing my real estate attorney to explain her actual legal situation and options. What we discovered was that Mrs. Patterson's property was worth at least twice what Tessa had been offering, and that she had absolutely no obligation to sell to anyone. More importantly, she was completely fed up with Tessa's bullying tactics. That woman has been making my life miserable for months, Mrs. Patterson told us. She acts like she owns the place, threatens me with legal action every week, and keeps telling me I'm too old to manage my own property. I'd love nothing more than to see her get what she deserves. By the end of our meeting, Mrs. Patterson had agreed to sell her property to me instead, at a fair market price that would give her enough money to move to a nice senior community near her daughter. The sale would also give me ownership of the house that Tessa was currently renting, putting me in position to serve her with a real eviction notice. But I had decided to keep this development secret until the sale was completed, giving Tessa just enough rope to hang herself with her increasingly desperate tactics. The closing was scheduled for the following week, and I couldn't wait to see the look on Tessa's face when she realized that her victim had become her landlord. The irony would be absolutely perfect. The woman who had tried to kick me off my own land would find herself homeless because of her own illegal schemes. While the paperwork moved forward, I continued documenting Tessa's harassment campaign, knowing that every fake legal document and intimidation tactic would become evidence in the criminal case I was planning to file. She was digging her own grave deeper with every passing day, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse around her. Tessa's financial desperation became clear through the private investigator's research. She was deeply in debt with multiple maxed-out credit cards and a history of failed business ventures. Her rental payments to Mrs. Patterson were often late, and she'd been served with eviction notices twice before talking her way into extensions. Her entire lifestyle was financed by credit, and she desperately needed this scheme to work to avoid bankruptcy. My property, with its valuable water rights, represented her last chance to make enough money to dig herself out of the financial hole she'd created. This explained the increasingly frantic and reckless nature of her harassment campaign. She was running out of time and options, making her more dangerous but also more likely to make the kind of mistakes that would destroy her completely. While the paperwork for Mrs. Patterson's property sale moved forward quietly, Tessa's harassment campaign reached new levels of desperation. She had apparently figured out that fake inspectors weren't working, so she shifted to more direct intimidation. Clinton filed what he claimed was a formal legal complaint with the county, alleging that my cabin violated multiple building codes and environmental regulations. When I called the county to inquire, they had no record of anything filed by Clinton Ames or any Ash Hollow Homeowners Association. It turned out that Clinton had simply sent threatening letters on fake letterhead, hoping I wouldn't bother to verify their legitimacy. The fake legal documents were elaborate, complete with official-looking seals and made-up case numbers, even including a fictitious court date where I was supposedly required to appear and defend my property rights. Tessa also escalated her social media campaign, posting daily updates about the dangerous situation in Ash Hollow and calling for community action to protect families from antisocial elements. She'd convinced herself that she was some kind of crusader for neighborhood safety, when in reality she was just a con artist trying to steal people's property. Her posts were filled with vague insinuations about isolated individuals with concerning behavior patterns and a need for proactive community intervention, never mentioning me by name, but making it obvious to anyone in the area that I was her target. The community response was mixed, which actually worked in my favor. About half the neighbors bought into her fear-mongering, while the other half, led by Lois and several longtime residents, saw through her manipulation and were getting increasingly annoyed with her dramatic tactics. The division became clear during an emergency neighborhood safety meeting that Tessa organized at the local community center. She'd posted flyers advertising the meeting as sponsored by the Ash Hollow Homeowners Association and featuring important safety information for all residents. Of course, she hadn't invited me to this meeting about me, but Lois attended and gave me a full report. About 20 people showed up, and Tessa gave a presentation that was part paranoid conspiracy theory and part real estate sales pitch. She had this whole slideshow about isolated residents and community risk factors, Lois told me, barely containing her laughter. She kept showing ridiculous graphs that she'd obviously made up, but then halfway through, she started talking about exciting development opportunities and property value enhancement. Several people walked out when it became obvious the meeting was more about her business schemes than actual safety. The most telling moment came when someone asked Tessa directly what specific safety issues I had actually caused. Her response was revealing. Well, it's not about specific incidents. It's about risk assessment and preventive community management. We can't wait for something bad to happen before taking action. When pressed for details, she'd started talking about concerning behavioral patterns and failure to participate in community engagement activities. Basically, she was arguing that I was dangerous because I minded my own business and didn't want to join her fake HOA, Even some of her supporters seemed uncomfortable with how flimsy her actual evidence was. The meeting ended with Tessa requesting signatures on a petition for the county to investigate my property, but she only got about 8 signatures, mostly from people who didn't really know me but were worried about property values. Meanwhile, my closing on Mrs. Patterson's property was proceeding smoothly. The property inspection revealed no major issues, and the title search confirmed clear ownership with no liens. More importantly, the title search revealed that Tessa's rental agreement was month to month, with no lease protections, meaning she could be evicted with just 30 days' notice. I was careful to keep all this information confidential until the sale was finalized, but I was already looking forward to serving Tessa with her own eviction notice. The irony would be absolutely perfect. The woman who had tried to kick me off my land would find herself homeless because of her own schemes. Mrs. Patterson was thrilled to escape Tessa's constant pressure and threats, signing the papers with obvious relief and excitement about her move to the senior community. The private investigator had also uncovered more details about Tessa's financial situation, painting a picture of someone living completely beyond her means and desperate for a big score. She owed money to multiple creditors, had been evicted from previous residences, and was facing potential bankruptcy if this scheme didn't work out. Her harassment campaign against me wasn't just about greed, it was about survival. She'd bet everything on this fraudulent HOA scheme, and my refusal to be intimidated was threatening to destroy her last chance at financial recovery. This desperation made her increasingly reckless and aggressive, but it also meant she was more likely to make the kind of serious mistakes that would lead to criminal prosecution. By the end of the week, I had become the legal owner of the house Tessa was renting, though she had no idea that anything had changed. Mrs. Patterson had agreed to let me handle informing Tessa about the ownership change in my own way and timing, and I was planning to make it as dramatic and satisfying as possible. The woman who had spent weeks trying to drive me off my property through fake legal threats was about to discover that she was now at the mercy of the very person she'd been trying to destroy. The tables had turned completely, and Tessa had no idea what was coming. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to spring my trap and watch her world fall apart. The closing on Mrs. Patterson's property took place on a Wednesday morning at my attorney's office, with Mrs. Patterson looking relieved and excited about her move to the senior community. "I can't tell you how happy I am to be done with all this drama," she told me as we signed the final paperwork. "Tessa has been making my life miserable for months, and I'm looking forward to living somewhere peaceful again." With the deed transfer complete, I was now officially Tessa's landlord, though she had no idea that anything had changed. I decided to keep this development secret while giving Tessa enough rope to hang herself with her increasingly desperate tactics. That same afternoon, Tessa made her biggest mistake yet. Apparently frustrated by my continued refusal to be intimidated, she decided to escalate to what she probably thought was the nuclear option. Clinton filed what he claimed was a restraining order petition against me, alleging that I had threatened community safety through intimidating behavior and refusal to comply with lawful authority. The petition was filled with completely fabricated incidents, claiming I had aggressively confronted community representatives and made implicit threats against neighborhood families. Of course, Clinton had no authority to file actual legal documents, but this fake petition crossed the line from harassment into criminal fraud. More importantly, she'd made specific allegations that could be easily disproven with the security camera footage I'd been collecting. I decided it was time to spring my trap. First, I contacted the county sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint about the fake legal documents, providing evidence of Clinton's fraudulent activities and Tessa's harassment campaign. The deputy who took my report was very interested in the fake restraining order petition, especially since impersonating legal authority is a serious felony. "We've been getting more of these fake HOA cases lately," the deputy told me. "People think they can intimidate their neighbors with official-looking paperwork, but they don't realize how serious the criminal penalties are." Next, I arranged for a process server to deliver a formal notice to Tessa, informing her that the property ownership had changed and that I was now her landlord. I wanted to see how she'd react to this news before delivering the final blow. The process server found Tessa at home around 6 in the evening, and according to his report, her reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. She seemed completely shocked. First, she claimed it was impossible. Then she demanded to see proof. Then she started making threats about legal action and community safety concerns. She was definitely rattled. Tessa's panic became even more obvious when she called me directly about an hour later, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. She accused me of tricking Mrs. Patterson and claimed I was harassing community safety advocates, threatening legal protections and community support. When I calmly explained that I was indeed her landlord and that Mrs. Patterson had been relieved to escape her bullying tactics, there was a long pause before she finally said, "This isn't over. I have resources you don't know about." The next morning brought the most satisfying development yet. Tessa, clearly operating in full panic mode, decided to file what she claimed was an emergency injunction to prevent me from retaliating against community safety advocates through property manipulation. She'd convinced Clinton to draft an official-looking petition requesting immediate court intervention to protect her from my escalating harassment tactics. The document was quite impressive from a creative writing standpoint, full of legal-sounding language and dramatic claims about community safety and tenant rights. Unfortunately for Tessa, she made the mistake of trying to file this fake injunction at the actual county courthouse, where the clerk immediately recognized it as fraudulent and called security. Within minutes, both Tessa and Clinton were being questioned by sheriff's deputies about their attempt to file false legal documents. According to the deputy who called me later, Tessa had insisted she was a legitimate community leader protecting neighborhood safety, while Clinton had tried to claim he was a legal representative operating within proper guidelines. The courthouse incident was the final straw for many of Tessa's remaining supporters in the community. Word spread quickly that she'd been arrested for filing fake court documents, and suddenly her claims about being a legitimate community advocate looked much less credible. Several neighbors who had signed her petition called to ask if they could remove their names, and the emergency meetings she'd been organizing stopped attracting attendees. By the weekend, I was ready to deliver the final blow. I had the process server deliver a formal 30-day eviction notice to Tessa, citing her month-to-month rental agreement and my right as the new property owner to reclaim the premises. The notice was completely legal and properly executed, unlike every fake document she'd been throwing around for weeks. But the real masterpiece was the language I'd included. You have 30 days to vacate the premises and remove all personal property. This notice is being served in accordance with state landlord-tenant law and represents the legitimate exercise of property ownership rights. It was almost word for word what she'd said to me in that first fake eviction notice, except this time it was real. The woman who had tried to kick me off my own land was about to be evicted by the very person she'd been trying to destroy. The irony was absolutely perfect, and I couldn't wait to see how Tessa would react when she realized that her harassment campaign had backfired so completely. She'd gone from being a fake authority figure trying to steal my property, to being a tenant at my mercy, facing eviction because of her own illegal activities. The tables had turned in the most satisfying way possible, and justice was finally being served. All her fake legal threats, intimidation tactics, and community manipulation had ultimately led to her own downfall. Sometimes the best revenge really is just letting bullies destroy themselves while you document everything and wait for the perfect moment to strike back. Tessa's reaction to the real eviction notice was everything I could have hoped for and more. According to Lois, who witnessed the scene from her kitchen window, Tessa came running out of the house screaming at the process server, demanding to know who gave him authority to deliver harassment documents to community safety advocates. She tried to refuse the notice, claiming it was another fake legal document designed to intimidate legitimate HOA representatives. But the process server calmly explained that it was a real eviction notice, filed through proper legal channels. When Tessa realized this wasn't another one of her fake documents, she completely lost control and started making threats about exposing this conspiracy to destroy community safety initiatives. The next few days were a masterclass in watching a scam artist's world fall apart in real time. Tessa tried to rally community support by organizing what she called an emergency response to landlord harassment, but only 3 people showed up, and 2 of them left when they realized the meeting was just Tessa ranting about conspiracies and revenge plots. She posted increasingly frantic messages on local social media, claiming that outside agitators were trying to destroy community unity through property manipulation. But by this point, most people had figured out that Tessa was the problem, not the solution. Clinton, meanwhile, had completely abandoned ship after the courthouse incident, throwing Tessa under the bus and claiming she'd misrepresented her authority and misled him about the legal validity of their initiatives. The community's rejection of Tessa became increasingly visible and personal as the truth spread through Ash Hollow like wildfire. One by one, neighbors who had signed her original petition began calling to formally withdraw their names, with some even requesting written confirmation that they were no longer associated with her fake HOA. The Johnsons, who lived 2 streets over, actually drove to my cabin to apologize in person for being taken in by her act, as Miss Johnson put it. "We should have known better. her husband added, shaking his head. Anyone who tries to drive out a family that's been here for decades obviously doesn't understand what community really means. By the end of the week, someone had even put up a handmade poster at the bus stop that read, "Fake HOA equals fake leaders, protect your real neighbors," complete with Tessa's mugshot from the courthouse incident. The criminal investigation was moving forward quickly, with charges pending against Tessa for fraud, harassment, filing false documents, and elder abuse related to her treatment of Mrs. Patterson. The prosecutor was particularly interested in her history of similar schemes in other counties, and my private investigator's research was proving invaluable in building a pattern of criminal behavior. "This is exactly the kind of case we like to prosecute," the district attorney told me. "Serial scam artists who target elderly victims and use fake legal authority to steal people's property deserve serious consequences." Meanwhile, the legitimate development deal with Mountain View Resort was moving forward smoothly, with the company thrilled to work with the actual property owner instead of dealing with Tessa's fraudulent schemes. Tessa spent her final weeks in the rental house alternating between desperate attempts to find legal loopholes and increasingly unhinged social media rants about property theft conspiracies and community safety cover-ups. Her live streams became a study in progressive isolation and desperation. What had once been confident broadcasts to dozens of viewers dwindled to rambling monologues, watched by maybe 3 or 4 people, usually trolls who showed up just to mock her declining mental state. She would sit in the darkened living room, the blue glow of her phone screen illuminating her increasingly haggard face, as she spoke to an empty digital void about her persecution and the conspiracy of property thieves that had destroyed her life. The only sounds that broke through her isolation were the occasional knocks on the door from sheriff's deputies serving additional legal papers, each visit driving her deeper into paranoid delusion. She tried to claim that her rental agreement included implied tenant protections for community advocates, but her argument fell apart when my lawyer pointed out that no such protections exist in state law. She also attempted to organize a tenant rights protest to prevent her eviction, but the only people who showed up were a couple of remaining supporters and one reporter from the local newspaper who was more interested in exposing her scam than promoting her cause. The newspaper article that resulted was devastating, detailing how Tessa had attempted to steal valuable land through intimidation and fake legal documents, and including interviews with Mrs. Patterson about the elder abuse and neighbors who had been manipulated by her fear tactics. The headline read, "Local Woman's Fake HOA Scheme Exposed. Elderly Victims Speak Out," and it included a sidebar listing warning signs of property fraud that communities could watch for. When the media confronted Tessa with questions about her criminal charges and fraudulent activities, I positioned myself across the grassy area near the community center to watch the spectacle unfold. From that distance, I could see her clearly. No longer the self-appointed HOA queen who had once stood on my porch demanding I leave my own land, but just a desperate gambler who had lost everything on a bet that nobody would fight back. She was stumbling away from the cameras, her composure completely shattered, her fake authority exposed for what it had always been, an elaborate performance designed to steal what didn't belong to her. The contrast was stark and satisfying. The woman who had tried to project power and control was now reduced to a scrambling figure, retreating from the consequences of her own choices. Her carefully constructed facade of community leadership had crumbled, leaving only the pathetic reality of a con artist whose luck had finally run out. On the final day of her 30-day eviction notice, Tessa made one last desperate attempt to avoid leaving. She barricaded herself in the house and called the local news station, claiming she was a victim of property harassment and community safety retaliation. The news crew that showed up was the same reporter who had written the exposé article, so instead of getting sympathetic coverage, Tessa found herself being asked pointed questions about her criminal charges and fraudulent activity. The resulting news segment showed Tessa as an unhinged scam artist trying to play the victim after being caught red-handed. Even her final performance was a complete failure. She couldn't answer basic questions about her authority, couldn't provide documentation for her claims, and ended up looking like exactly what she was, a desperate liar, trying to talk her way out of well-deserved consequences. The sheriff's deputies who arrived to enforce the eviction were professional and efficient, giving Tessa a final opportunity to leave voluntarily before removing her belongings to the curb. She spent the entire eviction process screaming about illegal harassment and community safety conspiracies, but nobody was listening anymore. Clinton was nowhere to be seen, having already left town to avoid further criminal liability. By sunset, Tessa was loading her possessions into a rental truck, and by morning, she was gone from Ash Hollow forever. The fake HOA that had terrorized the community for months disappeared with her, leaving behind only a cautionary tale about what happens when scam artists target the wrong victim. The woman who had tried to kick me off my own land in 24 hours had ended up being evicted herself, facing criminal charges and losing everything she'd worked to steal. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. Tessa's criminal case resulted in felony convictions for fraud, filing false documents, and elder abuse, earning her 3 years in state prison and substantial restitution payments to Mrs. Patterson and other victims. Clinton received probation and community service in exchange for his cooperation, but his reputation was permanently destroyed, and he'd moved away to start over somewhere else. The Mountain View Resort development proceeded exactly as planned, with construction beginning on a luxury spa that would preserve the environmental integrity of the area while providing me with substantial annual income from the water rights lease. My cabin remained exactly where it had always been, now enhanced by professional landscaping and surrounded by hiking trails that complemented rather than competed with its rustic charm. Justice had been served in the most poetic way possible, and the entire community felt safer knowing that property scam artists would face real consequences for their crimes. 6 months after Tessa's eviction, Ash Hollow had returned to the peaceful community it had always been, but with valuable lessons learned about protecting property rights and recognizing scam artists. The criminal convictions had sent a clear message that fake HOA schemes wouldn't be tolerated, and several other communities had reached out for advice on fighting similar fraud. Mrs. Patterson was thriving in her new senior community, where she'd quickly become a leader in organizing social activities and advocating for residents' rights. Getting away from that horrible woman was the best thing that ever happened to me, she told me during one of our regular calls. I had no idea how much stress I was carrying until it was gone. The sale had provided her with enough money to live comfortably, while also establishing a scholarship fund for students studying elder law and victim advocacy. The community response had been overwhelmingly positive, with neighbors expressing gratitude for my willingness to fight back against Tessa's intimidation tactics. "You saved us all from that crazy woman," one neighbor told me. "She was making life miserable for everyone, but most of us were too scared to stand up to her fake legal threats." The experience had brought the community closer together, with Lois Whitaker emerging as an unofficial coordinator for voluntary neighborhood meetings focused on mutual aid and environmental protection rather than rules and enforcement. "Real leadership brings people together and empowers them to solve problems cooperatively," Lois observed. What Tessa was doing was just bullying disguised as community service. The new approach had been much more successful, with neighbors working together on trail maintenance, wildlife protection, and supporting elderly residents. The legal precedent set by Tessa's prosecution had attracted attention from law enforcement and property rights advocates across the state. My evidence collection methods had become a model for documenting and prosecuting fake HOA schemes, and I'd been invited to speak at seminars about recognizing and resisting intimidation tactics. The most important message I always shared was about the power of documentation and legal knowledge. These scam artists rely on people being too scared or too uninformed to fight back, I would tell audiences. But when you know your rights and document everything they do wrong, you can turn their own tactics against them. Don't let bullies win through intimidation. Make them prove their authority in court, where their lies will be exposed. My case had become a textbook example of how to fight back against property fraud while protecting community values. The financial benefits of the resort development had exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The annual licensing fee for the water rights provided substantial income, while the property value increases from the resort development had made me quite wealthy on paper. But more importantly, the development preserved the character and natural beauty that had made the area special in the first place. My grandfather's cabin remained the centerpiece of the property, enhanced by professional landscaping and surrounded by hiking trails that guests could use to explore the natural spring and forest. The resort company had hired me as a consultant for the project, ensuring that the development respected the area's history and environmental integrity while providing jobs and economic benefits for the local community. As I sat on my front porch one evening, watching the sunset over the same peaceful landscape my grandfather had loved 60 years earlier, I reflected on how the whole experience had changed my perspective on community, justice, and standing up for what's right. Tessa had tried to destroy my peace and steal my property through lies and intimidation, but her scheme had ultimately backfired in the most spectacular way possible. She'd ended up in prison while I'd become more prosperous and secure than ever before. The fake HOA that was supposed to drive me away had instead created opportunities that transformed my life for the better. The natural spring that she'd tried to steal was now providing sustainable income while being protected and shared responsibly with the wider community. I still get emails from people around the country who are dealing with HOA bullies and property scam artists, asking for advice on how to fight back. My response is always the same. Document everything, know your rights, and never let them think they can intimidate you into giving up what's rightfully yours. Sometimes the best defense really is becoming their landlord and evicting them from the community they tried to steal. Justice has a way of working out in the end, especially when good people are willing to stand up to bullies and fight for what's right. The woman who demanded I leave my cabin in 24 hours learned the hard way that some people refuse to be intimidated and that karma has a perfect sense of timing when it comes to delivering justice to those who deserve it most.